not sure if you wanted to start with the introductions, but we're just waiting on, I think, like 3 or 4 more people. So
yeah, actually, I will. I think I will also just record it with my phone until we get some help. If we don't, so we will have at least, the
audio.
Yeah, I mean, and the video also, but through my phone. So we will start right away. So good afternoon, everybody, and we are very, very happy to host our first lecture for the semester. I am Professor Niveen Nasari, Associate Professor in the Department of French and Italian and African Cultural Studies. I'm also the Director of Middle East Studies Program, and I welcome you all to our first talk of the fall semester with Professor Sahar Khamis from the University of Maryland. So I also would like to invite you all to check our website and, of course, get to know more about our upcoming talks, but also the certificate for our undergraduate students and all the events that we are co-sponsoring this semester. You all, and thank you very much for being part of this very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, this does seem like another focal point.
Sahar Khamis will be talking for 30-40 minutes, and then we will open the floor for Q&A. So I would like also to invite Professor Marwa Sharabi to introduce Professor Khamis and also lead the panel and the talk and the discussion. Professor Marwa, she us this semester in the departments of Gender and Women's Studies and also Political Science, and we are very happy to have her us and being one of our core faculty. Thank you also for all the attendees. So, Professor Marwa.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Niveen, for the introduction. And thank you so much, Dr. Khamis, for accepting our invitation. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. I would like to just to introduce you to the audience, and then we will jump to the talk right away. And then I will be collecting questions for you. And if I have questions, I will direct you as well. So first, I would like to introduce Dr. Khamis, who is an associate professor in the Department of Communication. She's an affiliate professor in the Department of Women's Studies and the Consortium on Race, Gender, and Ethnicity at the University of Maryland. She is an expert on Arab and Muslim media and the former head of the Mass Communication Department at Qatar University. She holds a PhD in Mass Media and Cultural Studies from the University of Manchester. And she is the author of the books Islam.com, Contemporary Islamic Discourse in Cyberspace, and the Egyptian Revolution 2.0, Political Blogging, Civil Engagement, and Citizen Journalism, published in 2013 by Belgrave Macmillan. And she's also the co-editor of the book Arab Women's Activism and Social Political Transformation, Unfinished Gendered Revolutions, published by Belgrave Macmillan in 2018, and this will be the focus of her talk today. We would like to thank. I would also like to thank everybody who is participating today, and my students, who I see a lot of them on the list. Please. Be very happy to that as well. Without any more wait, I will give the floor to Dr. Khamis, and I hope you enjoy the talk.
Thank you so much, Professor Marwa. Thanks so much to the Middle East Studies Program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison for this kind invitation. Indeed, it's an honor and a pleasure to join you all today. Thanks so much to Professor Niveen Nasiri for the invitation and for organizing this, and to Professor Marwa Shalabi for the kind introduction, and for moderating, and for Tyler for her technical assistance and help today. So a great team here. Yes. So I'm going to start with my PowerPoint presentation, which is going to be based really on my last book that Marwa just mentioned now, which is Arab Women's Activism and Socio-Political Transformation, Unfinished Gendered Revolutions. Once I'm done with the talk and the PowerPoint, then we can definitely open the floor for the Q&A, which I'm sure is going to be the most interesting and engaging part of the discussion this afternoon. All right, so I'm going to be talking about Arab women's shifting identities, activisms, and resistances, their unfinished gendered revolutions in the Arab region. And why did I particularly choose to talk about this topic? Well, we need to deconstruct many of the myths and many of the stereotypes about Arab women who have been historically, unfortunately, depicted as powerless, marginalized, or simply have been sexualized, seen as erotic objects, or all of the above. So the media images or mediated images about Arab women have not been very flattering, to say the least. Also revealing many of the phases and faces of Arab women and their multiple activisms, identities, and resistances, which have been always intertwined with their lived realities, political realities, and social realities in their own respective countries, and illustrating how these activisms and resistances and struggles cross-cut the political, social, as well as the legal spheres simultaneously. Before going further, just let me tell you that this last book that I just mentioned, Arab Women's Activism and Socio-Political Transformation, Unfinished Gendered Revolutions, was co-edited by myself and my co-editor, Professor Amal Mili. She was with the University of Pennsylvania, and now she is with Drexel University. And she has been a lawyer and she has been a judge in Tunisia. That's a very important point to remember, because I believe that the legal sphere, as we're going to talk about it this afternoon, has been oftentimes overlooked in our discussions about Arab women. And I think it's about time that we revisit and pay attention to this very important legal aspect. Also, it's very important to illustrate how these activisms and resistances extend before, during, and after the Arab Spring uprisings, and in both Arab Spring as well as non-Arab Spring countries, although of course in different forms, degrees, and intensities, and through different modes of expression. This is a very important point, because many people, when they talk about women's activism, especially Arab women's activism, they always attach it to the moment of the Arab Spring, right? It's as if women's activism only, started with the Arab Spring. This is not true, because there have been phases of activism and feminist movements in the region way before the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring just provided this very important use of cyber activism and cyber feminism, as we're going to talk about it. But it's important to acknowledge women's presence and existence and activisms and resistances before, during, and after the Arab Spring uprising. Also shedding light on some of the most important opportunities, threats, and uncertainties facing Arab women and their movements today, and deconstructing the notion of a uniform, standard, fixed form of feminism, which is oftentimes defined as Western feminism from a very Western, narrow, ethnocentric, Eurocentric perspective. And that's very important, because I prefer to talk about multiple activisms with a plural S, and to talk about multiple feminisms with a plural S, right? We cannot just put everybody in the same basket and look at women as just one category and, they're all going to act or behave or, do things the same way. That is simply unrealistic and unfair. We have to talk about three layers of invisibility and marginalization that Arab women have been subjected to. Women in general, but Arab women, Middle Eastern women in particular, have historically suffered from three layers of invisibility and marginalization. The first one is invisibility in the socioeconomic domain because of their undocumented informal labor. It means basically they're working and they're putting in a lot of hours. I think the undocumented labor of women around the world, hold your breath to hear this one, is about $35 billion a day. $35 billion a day. That's way beyond the revenue from the tech industry, for example. Yet, oftentimes this effort is undocumented, is unappreciated, because it's informal and they don't get any kind of documented formal payment for it. So that's really a big unfortunate thing for them. Second, invisibility in the academic literature, which there's definitely a lot of underrepresentation of Middle Eastern women and Arab women in the literature. We need to actually create more space, and I believe this webinar discussion we're having today is a good step in the right direction. We need to see more Middle Eastern studies program that invite voices from within the region and take into account Middle Eastern women and Arab women's realities, identities, and perspectives. And we need to see more literature addressing them, not from a Western only, strictly Eurocentric, ethnocentric perspective, as mentioned, but most importantly, taking into account their own identities, their own voices, and their own agencies based on their own lived realities. And third, there is invisibility in the media through either the exclusion or underrepresentation of women's voices altogether. Their images, identities, and realities are somehow obscure or not represented, or through stereotypical, false, and skewed misrepresentations, which either depict images of oppression and helplessness or sexual objectification, or both. So in other words, the images, as we talked about it before, have not been flattering in the media and have been either marginalizing and excluding women, adding to their own existing invisibility and marginalization, or in other cases, just simply objectifying them and sexualizing them, as you see them only, as belly dancers or stuff like that, but you don't see the hardworking women, in the field, and, the nurses and doctors and professors and so on. So Arab women have been engaging in three parallel struggles simultaneously, and that's one of the main themes in this last book, Arab Women's Activism, that there are three parallel struggles taking place side by side. The first one is the political struggle to free their countries, of course, from the forces of dictatorship, autocracy, and authoritarianism. In engaging in this type of resistance and struggle, Arab women across different ideological orientations and demographic categories have been actively engaging in resistance movements over many decades. So as I said, it did not just start with the Arab Spring, because it's been extending way before that. These political resistance movements extended way before the Arab Spring, and they have also included different forms and various degrees of intensity and resistance, right? If you talk about, for example, the liberation movements in the region, or the resistance to colonialism or imperialism, you see that women were also involved in many of these movements and active in them as well, helping women to gain the right to vote and to be politically represented. All of these are political struggles for women in the region. One relatively recent example, however, was women's active participation, for example, in a group which is known as No Military Trials for Civilians, لا للمحاكمات العسكرية للمدنيين, which was created when SCAF, the Supreme Council for the Armed Forces in Egypt, took over after the ousting of President Mubarak. And during this transitional period, there was some kind of, somehow relatively, let's put it this way, open space for more expression and more diversity that did not really exist before or after. During this period, the Egyptian women had a lot of political activism. And for example, you had the lawyers, Mona Saif and Ragia Umran and others. They assumed political leadership in this group. So they did not just join a group, they were actually leaders in these types of political groups, setting bright examples, not just for other women to follow, but in my opinion, for men to follow as well, with their own bravery and courage and heroism in fighting for political rights and speaking up and taking leadership positions in this regard. Of course, we all know this young lady, Asma Mahfouz. She's been one of the iconic figures in the midst of the Egyptian revolution of 2011. Some people even called her, quote unquote, the most brave girl in Egypt for her vlog. I'm sure a lot of the young participants today, they are very familiar with this kind of terminology. So when you blog using a video, that's actually vlogging. So she vlogged with this beautiful video, which is on YouTube. And of course, I really encourage you to watch it. We don't have time to do that today, but I really encourage you to watch it because it was very powerful and very strong, the kind of words and language she used in order to say, I'm a girl, but I'm very bold, I'm very courageous, and I'm speaking up and I'm asking for the removal of 30-year dictator Hosni Mubarak. So please join me on January 25th, 2011. However, the political struggle side by side with men has not been the only struggle that Arab women have been involved in. There is another struggle which is particularly, quote unquote, gender-centered, right? So it is specifically, oriented or targeted for women in particular, which is the social struggle. The social struggle to resist different forms of discrimination, prejudice, and bias against women, as well as overcoming some of the negative, harmful practices against them, such as sexual harassment and domestic violence, and all of these things. So basically, this is a struggle that is particularly important for women, taking into account the fact that they become targets for all of these evils, right? For sexual harassment and intimidation and domestic violence. So they said, this is an opportunity to also make our voices heard, not just in the political sphere, but also in the social sphere. One good example in this regard was a successful campaign which started in Egypt that was called Shuft Taharrush, which means I saw harassment, and also the application which is called Harass Map. This illustrates a spillover from the realm of citizen journalism in the realm of mainstream media, where actually public opinion was started to be influenced by these issues. So what happened was a number of bloggers and social media activists at the time, such as this young lady Nawara Nigma, who is a very big Twitterati. She had a lot of followers, hundreds of thousands of followers on her blog and on her Twitter account. And she became very vocal and very active, not just in the political realm or the political sphere, but also in the social sphere, speaking up against a problem like, for example, sexual harassment on the streets of Cairo that has been considered, quote unquote, a taboo. So what we are witnessing here is really breaking taboos. Whether you are breaking taboos in the political realm by calling for the ousting of a long-term dictator and changing of a political system or a political structure, and you are talking against corruption and against violations of human rights, right? And you're also in parallel breaking taboos in the social realm by speaking about equally sensitive and taboo issues like sexual harassment on the street that the mainstream media did not dare to talk about. That's why I'm saying a spillover from the realm of citizen journalism into the realm of mainstream media, forcing the mainstream media, if I can use this word, to actually address these sensitive issues and to address these taboo issues for the first time. Let me also mention something about Harass Map. Harass Map was this application that actually shows you places where harassment takes place. So for example, if you see an area with a red color, that means this area has a very high level of harassment. If the color is yellow, it's mild. If the color is green, then it's a safe area to be in. And this Harass Map application was created by both young men and young women together. It's very important not to neglect, in my opinion, the partnership and the engagement of men, right? Because, women are half of society, right? And of course, we give birth to the other half, which makes us a little bit more important, I guess. But men are our partners and allies and even our advocates, and they should not be neglected in this whole process. In this last book, I mentioned Arab women's activism. We had one, author in the book who was actually a man from Morocco, Professor Ibrahim Al-Wadli, and he did an excellent chapter on Moroccan women. So we should not neglect men's engagement, whether, in my opinion, in writing on women's issues or actually participating in the realm of creating applications and other platforms to resolve issues related to women. Because at the end of the day, if a certain group or a certain part of society is oppressed, all of society is oppressed. And the third struggle is the legal struggle to either pass new laws and legislations which can be useful and beneficial for women, or to change some of the already existing negative laws which are discriminatory against women. So one good example, very bright example, was the passing of the new groundbreaking law against domestic violence in Tunisia, which was hailed by many for its comprehensiveness, gender equity, and inclusion, since it really prohibited all forms of violence against women, whether it is physical violence, sexual violence, social violence, economic violence, or political violence. In other words, for a long time, domestic violence was perceived as, quote unquote, a private issue. Oh, a man hits his wife or slaps her on the face, who cares? That's just a private issue. Why should society even be bothered about it or care about it? This law is saying no. Domestic violence is a public issue, not a private issue. And violence against women more broadly should not be defined as just, quote unquote, domestic violence. If a woman is denied a job just because she's a woman, that's economic violence. If she is denied the right to vote just because she's a woman, that's political violence. If she faces harassment and intimidation on the street just for being a woman, that's social violence. So in other words, you're taking the word violence and you're redefining it in a much broader perspective, which is much more encompassing and much more comprehensive. By doing so, this law, of course, took the word violence, as we said, from the private domain, the private domestic sphere, into the public sphere. It also raised the age of marriage for women, prohibited all forms of gender-based discrimination, and it eliminated the so-called, quote-unquote, law of shame, which was, infamously known as the marry your rapist law. It was a very bad law which actually allowed the men who commit crimes of rape against women to escape legal punishment by marrying their victim. So that's a horrible law, and basically what it meant was punishing the woman twice. So one time she is punished by rape, and another time she is punished by marrying her rapist, which is of course a horrible thing. There's no question about it. So Tunisia repealed this shameful law of shame, and other countries followed in its footsteps. Lebanon and Jordan afterwards also emulated this great example, and they also erased this law. And I think it should be erased everywhere, should not exist anywhere in the world. The involvement of women in drafting these laws has been very important, or even we can say historic, very historic step. It was a major driving force behind the victory, exemplified in passing this new law, as well as previously gender-sensitive laws, which have either discriminated against women or neglected them altogether. So here it's useful to highlight that women across the board, including those from the moderate Islamist party Al-Nahda, as well as from more secular liberal camps, all of them collaborated in Tunisia in order to create this success and to bring to light the issuance of this new law, which really creates a very important point here, which is the importance of alliances. We're going to talk about this in a moment. The importance of creating alliances and bridging the gaps between different parties and different groups, even if they don't share the same ideological views or ideological orientations. At least we can agree that women's education is important. Who is going to disagree on that? Right? Women's equal employment is important. Who's going to disagree on that? Right? Domestic violence is bad. Who's going to disagree on that? Women should be safe on the street and should not be facing harassment. Who can disagree on that? So creating these alliances and bridging the gaps was a very important reason, in my opinion, for the success of the Tunisian example or case. And the absence of this bridge building has been one of the reasons for the unsuccessful experiments in other countries, whether on the political domain or in the social domain when it comes to women's issues and women's rights. Although there has been, generally speaking, positive correlations between the degree of political freedom allowed in a certain country and the progress made in terms of women's rights, whether politically, socially, or legally, one interesting paradoxical anomaly was the case of Bahrain. So in general, we can say that the more you have a margin of political freedom in a country, the more you have democracy, the more you have a liberal space, the more you have an open public sphere, the more women's rights and women's issues are going to be advanced. That's the norm. But there are always exceptions to every rule. And one of the exceptions here was the case of Bahrain, which came as an anomaly. The crackdown on political opposition in Bahrain by the regime in power actually led to imprisoning some of the Shiite religious leaders who had very strict views on issues related to women and women's rights, including a family law which gave women in Bahrain the same rights as men, including granting their own children the Bahraini citizenship if the father is not Bahraini. If the mother married a foreigner, she can still pass on the nationality to her own children. So I'm not advocating the imprisonment of anyone here, but I'm just saying that this is one example where this political crackdown, strangely enough, was actually the reason for some kind of light at the end of the tunnel for women in this particular case. But as I said, this is not the norm. The norm is the more political freedom you have, the more social opening or political activism and social activism we actually see on the ground and online. So grassroots activism became very big, of course, in the midst of the Arab Spring movements. We have seen grassroots popular movements, peaceful protests across the board. We have seen the significant role of youth and the significant role of women. We have seen social media playing a very important role as catalysts for change. We have seen different outcomes unfolding in different countries. Of course, not all of them had the same degree of success as we know. Some of them had severe detours or even reversals in their journey for democratization and reform, and that is a fact, unfortunately. But this grassroots activism really was inspired at this moment. So as I said before, there was activism before the Arab Spring, but in many cases was not really at the grassroots level as we have witnessed in the midst of the Arab Spring uprisings. So women's activism in the Arab Spring, women played a very visible role in the Arab Spring movement. Many of them took part in non-stereotypical gender roles. In other words, they were not just nursing or nurturing or supporting men, but rather they were very much at the front lines, risking their own lives and facing the risks of injury, arrest, harassment, or even death. Right? So there were activists, there were protesters, and there were journalists who actually were imprisoned or arrested or even killed in the midst of these protests, which is a very important thing to remember. We had the selection of Tawakkul Karman, the Yemeni activist and journalist, who came to be known as, quote unquote, the mother of the Yemeni revolution. And she was the first Arab woman ever to be awarded the Nobel Prize. A very, of course, significant recognition and appreciation for the Arab Spring in general, but it was really specifically a nod of appreciation for the role of Arab women in these movements in particular. Here is one of my favorite photos. You see here this middle-class Egyptian woman. She looks like, just a middle-class woman, right? And she is coming out there. She's holding this sign. She's trying to make her voice heard. She is participating effectively in the protests and the uprisings in the midst of the Egyptian revolution in 2011. And she's holding this sign that says, Wael Ghunaim has been arrested. He's one of the famous activists in the midst of the Egyptian revolution. He has been arrested. Who is going to be next? Please free him from jail as soon as possible. So women were very much visible on the ground and on the streets. And it was women across the board. Muslims, Christians, veiled, unveiled, liberal, secular, Islamist, you name it. It was really across the board. So redefining activism and resistance, the emergence of bottom-up horizontal grassroots activism, which engages the widest possible segments of society, meant that we have to really rethink this whole process of activism and resistance, rethink about denouncing government-manufactured activism, which was really a form of tokenism or cosmetic feminism. What I mean by that is even when women participated in some of the previous phases in feminist movements, they were either co-opted by men, right? And they came only from the elite, segments of society, Western educated, rich, upper middle class, elitist women who did not necessarily represent the entire society as a whole. Or you had cases where there was actually what we call the case of the First Lady syndrome. The First Lady syndrome is another form of cosmetic feminism as well. The First Lady actually hails a certain movement or adopts a certain cause, and you see everyone else following her or following in her footsteps. This created what we call tokenism or cosmetic feminism. What I mean by that is it did not really trickle down to the wider basis or the grassroots basis of society. The birth of empowerment as an indigenous autonomous effort on the part of women themselves to enact change with their own hands and according to their own speed and voices really was activated and became clearer in the midst of the Arab Spring movements. The birth of parallel revolutions, which we can describe as socio-political revolutions, right? Social and political at the same time simultaneously, was also clearer in this particular phase. The role of cyberfeminism, one of my main areas of specialization and my favorite topics, of course. The term cyberfeminism refers to the process whereby women deploy new forms of communication, mainly online and new media forms of communication, to advocate for their own rights, causes, and demands, and to fight various forms of discrimination, injustice, and oppression. It is considered the sister phenomena for the term cyber activism, which refers to the use of the media to advance a cause which is difficult to advance offline. Women hailed the role of new media in serving their own causes and helping their own plans and agendas in particular, and giving them more visibility and helping them to fight and to really defy power and authority in general. When I interviewed some of the young activists in my own research, many of them said the new media and social media are like a window through which we can see the rest of the world while being seen by the rest of the world simultaneously. So that's how we open this window, especially if you're talking about conservative traditional societies, right? Like some of the Gulf countries or Yemen and so on. These traditional societies don't give the same space for women to be able to participate in the public sphere. So for them, the presence of social media and new media became an important window for them to see the rest of the world while being seen by the rest of the world simultaneously. Most of the women activists I interviewed talked about social media and new media as performing three main functions: mobilization, documentation, and education. So mobilization means rallying support for certain causes which are important for women, collecting the needed funds and securing the needed resources to help them. For example, take the case of helping Syrian refugees or helping rape victims. Many of them took to social media to start some of these campaigns on a large scale and to start to gain support, awareness and support, and also funds and resources to help these important causes. Documentation means using their own cameras and cell phones to show the whole world incidents of brutality, humiliation, or harassment against women. Some of the young women said, if someone is going to come and try to harass me or arrest me, guess what? I'm going to use my cell phone as my weapon. It's going to be my weapon to try to defy whoever tries to harass me or tries to intimidate me or arrest me, because it's going to be documented and it's going to go viral. And education means raising awareness about women's issues and discovering and really discussing them with the rest of the world through positive media, what they described as positive media, meaning media that changes and challenges the stereotypical images about women and tries to educate the public about the importance of women's issues. These were the three main functions: mobilization, documentation, and education, that were voiced by a lot of the women activists in the region. However, just like everything else in life, Social media, I always say it's not magic, it's not a magical tool, and it cannot bring change all by itself. It has its own potentials, but it also has its own limitations. So while social media may aid socio-political change as catalysts, they may speed up the process of political change. They're not magical tools and they cannot bring change all by themselves. It is always the people, in the case of women themselves, who can create this actual change on the ground if and when they decide to do so. It is wise to adopt, therefore, what we call a perspective or a middle ground balanced approach of cyber realism, which stays away from the two undesirable extremes of either cyber pessimism or cyber optimism. In other words, try to see it for what it is, acknowledge the strengths, but also acknowledge the limitations in parallel. So the last part of this presentation is about gains and opportunities, threats, as well as uncertainties. So the gains and opportunities, Arab women today have a lot of opportunities for them, a lot of support for their causes, spread of their messages, making their voices heard in some unprecedented ways. In many cases, social media played a very important role in this process. Social media are providing Arab women today with unique opportunities, as we said before, a window to see the world and to be seen by the rest of the world, but also gave them tools, important tools to network, to organize, and to mobilize. The affordability, accessibility, interactivity, and immediacy of these tools made them especially important for enacting socio-political change. And as I said before, that's especially more important in maybe more conservative, more traditional societies where this kind of reliance on social media then becomes important. But here, of course, you can also run into the danger of what, quote unquote, the digital divide, that not everybody has the same access to 24/7 high-speed internet in every area. And that's something else we have to bear in our minds as well. The rise of new young Arab women activists who are actually combining online and offline activism to fight for their own political, social, and legal rights and causes in particularly important and useful ways. And these became very important public opinion leaders. They became public opinion leaders, setting excellent role models, not just for other women, but more importantly, even for men. So some of the men who witnessed, somebody like Tawakkul Karman coming out of Yemen, a conservative traditional society, and becoming a role model and even getting the Nobel Prize, or a young woman like Ayat al-Gumaizi in Bahrain, 20-year-old, and stands up in the midst of the Manama, the capital of Bahrain, and talks about, the injustice which is imposed by the regime. All of that. Young men started to say, we are looking up to these young women and seeing them as role models for everyone, men and women alike. Also, the increase in youth activism, especially very important and relevant here when it comes to supporting women's issues, since both youth and women could be considered two sides of the same coin, if you will. Many of these young women we're talking about were under the age of 40 when they actually participated. Many of them were in their 20s or 30s, so they were definitely under the age of 40. And, youth activism then became a very important, catalyst for women's activism, or we can say they're both two sides of the same coin. However, like everything else in life, there are also threats and challenges which are confronting Arab women. We cannot paint a very rosy picture, which is like everything is great, because it's not. We have seen the reversals in freedom in post-Arab Spring countries. We have seen, countries being torn by war, countries reversing their own journey to democratization in very negative and very detrimental ways. We have seen the shift from solidarity to fragmentation and polarization in a number of the so-called, quote-unquote, Arab Spring countries. We have seen the creation of an unsafe public space for women through, unfortunately, things like sexual harassment, rape, virginity testing, violence, which are all being used as tools or weapons to try to intimidate women, right? To try to make them reluctant to participate in public or to play a more effective role, of course, in a very unfortunate and very negative way. Some people who are more on the liberal secular camp would say the rise of political Islam could be a threat, although we saw in the case of Tunisia that moderate Islamist parties were able to forge successful alliances with their counterparts in the liberal secular camp. So I really think it's about revisiting and understanding religion in a better way and trying to integrate it in a positive and constructive way to fight all the common enemies like ignorance and illiteracy and patriarchy, which is really affecting women in many negative ways. The reactionary patriarchal culture and stagnant traditions definitely is still there in many countries. There are still educational, economic, and infrastructural obstacles and constraints facing Arab women. The overshadowing and marginalization of women's contributions and their even sacrifices, right? So despite their numerous sacrifices, despite being at the front lines of resistance, right, or even fighting and being arrested, imprisoned, or even killed in some cases, women at the end of a certain movement or protest, or after the perceived success of a certain movement, they're being told, thank you so much, ladies, now it's time for you to go to the kitchen or the hair salon or go and do your nails. This is not fair because, guess what? We were just risking our own lives. So how can you possibly just put us aside and simply, do not acknowledge our own contributions and our own role? The uncertainties ahead, definitely the future of Arab women's movement and the progress they're going to be making is pretty much intertwined and interlinked with the future of their own countries. And it's no secret that many of these countries are now in flux. There's definitely a lot of limbo and a lot of chaos in many of these countries at the present time. This is applicable to countries where the struggle for freedom, and struggle for democracy really was reversed, as in the case of Syria, having the worst, of course, as we know, humanitarian disaster and civil war. Libya and Yemen being torn, Libya in the case of Libya, sectarian strife. In the case of Yemen, of course, the terrible war on Yemen. In the case of Egypt, we saw a reversal, a full detour or U-turn in the process of democratization. And Bahrain, which became a crushed and forgotten uprising, unfortunately, leaving us with the unique exception of Tunisia. A lot of people talk about quote-unquote Tunisian exceptionalism as such. So the results that really unfolded out of the Arab Spring movements have not been very favorable, and that in turn had negative implications and effects on Arab women's activism, and the uncertainty itself is also pretty much impacting Arab women's progress. So the most important points, just to sum up here and to conclude, the parallel struggles which Arab women have been involved in and taking part in, whether in the political, social, or legal spheres, over many decades, developed and evolved over several stages, extending before, during, and after the Arab Spring uprisings. These struggles are closely intertwined and interconnected with the complex realities witnessed in the different Arab countries, and it could be said to also both mirror and mold, in other words, their causes and effects of some of these shifting identities for women, since they both contribute to them as well as also reflect them in so many different ways. Women are being impacted by all of these changing realities on the ground, and they are also impacting them in a simultaneous, parallel, ongoing process at the same time. The importance and significance of women's activism, participation, and involvement in decision-making processes, as well as drafting new laws and regulations in the respective countries, is very important, and it does make a huge difference. We saw the case of Tunisia, women participating on the bench, being judges and being able to participate effectively in the process of drafting laws and being involved in the legal sphere, not just the social and political sphere, but also the legal sphere, does make a huge difference and has a huge impact. The significance of coalition building and bridge building to bridge the differences between different groups, as we saw also in the case of Tunisia, bridging the gaps between Islamist and secular camps and trying to create new alliances. The success of bottom-up grassroots activism is very important, acknowledging the contributions and limitations of the phenomena of cyberfeminism. Yes, talk about the positive and talk about the contributions, but also acknowledge some of the shortcomings and some of the limitations of all of this. So a final word. In looking ahead, it would be wise to adopt a realistic, balanced approach in predicting the future of the Arab women's movements and the varied forms of activisms and struggles and resistances in the context of ongoing socio-political transformations and changes in this changing region, which acknowledge their gains and contributions and their input, but also takes into account the challenges and threats and uncertainties which are confronting them simultaneously. In doing so, it would be wise to say that we can be gratified by what has been achieved and accomplished, but we should also be humbled by what remains to be achieved. Thank you so much, and I'm open to taking your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Khamis, for an excellent presentation. This is really intriguing. I have 4 questions from the audience, and I have a question for you as well. I will pose the question that I have, and the question of one of the students, and then I will continue. We have roughly 20 minutes. I hope that we get to answer all the questions we have. So the question that I have, and I know that you're interested in this as well, is what is the effect of the pandemic and the COVID-19 on female activism in the region at this point? And I can also field another question from the audience if you want to answer them after each other. So there's another question from a student asking about how that she knows that African women writers were often neglected from the history of African literature, and she's wondering if this Arab writers, women writers, had the same experience in when we talk about the Arab world.
Yeah, I'll start with the first question. Thank you so much, Professor Marwa. The first part of the question about COVID-19. Definitely, of course, the pandemic is changing our lives in so many different ways. There's no question about it, whether in the realm of education, social interaction, employment, work, you name it. Arab women, like I said in my presentation, have all of these potentials, but also have all of these limitations, right? And I think that a lot of the limitations, unfortunately, have been exacerbated or increased in the midst of this pandemic or in the midst of this health crisis. Because let's face it, a lot of women are health, care workers, right? And whether it's formally or informally means they are the caretakers, right? They're the ones who take care of the family. If there's a sick person in the family or a person who is ill, they are the ones who are taking care of that person. And that puts a big toll on them in terms of their own time and resources and physical effort, let alone the danger or the possibility of being infected themselves. As healthcare workers, oftentimes they're underpaid, unrecognized, and they don't have the proper, personal protective equipment to protect them while they're performing their job. And that is very true even in, developed countries, as we have witnessed here in the United States. But it's even more true if you're talking about less developed parts of the world, including the Arab world. So all of that puts new, limitations and new threats and new challenges to Arab women. Not to mention the increase also in incidents of domestic violence that happened, unfortunately, in the midst of the pandemic. We have seen a surge in domestic violence cases, which need to be acknowledged and resolved. Something definitely has to be done about it. And there is the digital divide, a very important point. We talked about, cyber feminism and cyber activism, and women can use technology. Absolutely true. But we cannot turn a blind eye to the fact that not everyone has access to high-speed, 24/7, internet access. It's not true. You have many parts of the world where women are denied this kind of access. They don't have access to resources, including economic resources and infrastructure resources and technological resources, and they cannot really get on the internet just like we're doing right now to have this kind of interesting conversation. So the digital divide is another real threat. And you can add to it so many other things, right? Economic disparities and social disparities. If you add all of that together, you can really find the picture is very bleak for women in the midst of the pandemic, not to mention women losing also their own male supporters, right? So the head of the household or the supporter might be gone because of illness or sickness or death. And that's another burden as well. But maybe there's one silver lining in this dark cloud, just to make ourselves a little bit more optimistic, right? And not to paint a very dark picture here. I believe there is now a golden opportunity for women to step up and to play more active and more visible roles and to become more vocal on so many different fronts, including leadership in the midst of the pandemic. It's another golden opportunity. It could be their second Arab Spring moment. We can call it this way, the second Arab Spring moment for them. They can really step up and they can really try to become more visible and to take on leadership positions. And women have always been excellent in the realm of philanthropy and giving and caring for the community and sharing with others, right? And they can really play this role in very many different effective ways. And I hope that can give them some kind of visibility and even some kind of advantage and having a place at the table. I always say, if you are not at the table, you will be on the menu, right? That's one of my favorite proverbs. And women have been on the menu for a very long time. So it's time to have them at the table now. As for the second question about African women, I'm not sure I completely understood the gist of the question. If you can summarize that for me again, please.
Yeah, I think the question is the African women writers, she says that they're often marginalized from writing history and discussing history of African literature. And she was asking if this is similar, is the experiences of female Arab writers, is the experience were similar or not?
I think that, we talked about 3 levels of invisibility or 3 levels of marginalization, right? When it comes to Arab women, we talked about the political marginalization, social marginalization. We talked about also marginalization in the realm of academia, right? And media academia. We talked about women being marginalized in literature, including academic literature. In other words, either they're not represented, they're not there, their voices are not represented, their voices are absent from the literature, or if they are, it can be from a completely, colonialist or, Eurocentric perspective, which does not really take into account their own agency and their own identity. So my answer to this question is yes, there is definitely a need to have better and more integration of academics from the Arab region and definitely in other parts of the world, Africa for sure, other Latin America, other parts of the world where women's literature and writing and academic contribution has not been equally, in my opinion, integrated in the academic sphere as well as in other spheres, as we talked about it politically, socially, and in the media.
Thank you. Thank you, Hannah, for the question. It's a great question. There's a question from Professor Tripp who's asking you, what diverse patterns do you see in women's mobilization across the MENA region?
Yeah, diverse patterns of marginalization. That's a very good question because definitely we cannot put the whole MENA region in the same boat. There are definitely countries that have more, academic and more maybe space for freedoms than others. There are those who have more technological savviness and technological, nuance than others. For example, we have seen in the Gulf countries that women are more able to have access to high-speed internet and more ability to use some of these technological tools compared to maybe less advantaged part of the world, of the Arab world, economically or technologically. However, this in itself is another double-edged sword in a very interesting way because you can get on the internet and you can also become visible. You can even become a Twitterati, right? You can have hundreds of thousands of followers and you can start to tweet and blog and write about what is bothering you and talk about the regime being repressive and talk about the limitations on freedom. But guess what? All of that also puts you in high risk because the visibility itself, once you become a public figure and you become more visible, that puts you at higher risk of imprisonment and retaliation from the regime. And that's exactly what we saw in the case of some of these activists, even especially in the Gulf region, where some of them have been imprisoned in countries like Bahrain and Saudi Arabia for their activism, right? So yes, there is more access to technology, but yes, that also can increase the risk of being under the regime's surveillance and therefore having a certain, dangerous results like arrest and imprisonment. In other parts of the Arab world, there have been, of course, during the Arab Spring movement in particular, both on the street activism coupled with online activism. The reversals in political freedom and the reversals in the whole process of democratization, as we saw in many of the so-called Arab Spring countries, has made this margin shrink significantly, whether online or on the ground. So a lot of these movements are not as vibrant or active, unfortunately, on the street or online because they are worried and scared of serious threats from the regimes in power. A lot of the bloggers, I mentioned, including Nawara Nigm and others, have stopped, closed their blogs altogether, stopped their activism online. We are seeing, if you will, a reversal in many of these forms of activism. My hope is that with the pandemic, being this curse, that it can also be a blessing in parallel, opening some space for Arab women's visibility and leadership in a different realm and different sphere, which is the social sphere.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Aili, for a great question. I have a question from Amy Yadav about she's wondering how harmful or helpful is the Western representation of Muslim women to their work in activism?
The representation, up till this moment has not been very accurate or very flattering, we should say. The majority of the literature and the depiction has not been really, doing justice to Arab women / Muslim women. They're either seen as repressed and marginalized and excluded from the public sphere. They don't have a voice. They're just in the harem or something like that, or they're being seen, as I said, as sexualized objects. We are seeing now some light at the end of the tunnel. I'm seeing some scholarship starting to emerge, with some Western writers, including Western women writers, in some of the women's studies, gender studies, sexuality studies programs, trying to fill some of these gaps. And most importantly, of course, we are seeing also a surge in indigenous voices of Arab and Muslim women themselves from within the region, right, who are starting to step up and to have their voices heard in academia. Is that enough? Is this sufficient? It is not sufficient. There are definitely baby steps, but they're baby steps in the right direction. I'm only hoping to see more and more of this contribution, whether from indigenous scholars from within the region or from Western scholars who come to acknowledge the plurality and complexity of Arab and Muslim women's identities and realities.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Amy, for the question. We have a question from Professor Jung as well, who's asking about divisions within Arab feminism. And she said that recently women in Indonesia, while propagating the idea of women's rights without feminism, she wonders if there is anything similar to this happening in any Arab countries?
I did not hear the sentence. Propagating women.
Sorry. I read it. I caught it a little bit when I was reading it. The reason that I'm asking this question is that there was an overwhelming rise of conservative and patriarchal voices among some Muslim women recently in Indonesia, while propagating the idea of women's rights without feminism. I wonder if there is anything similar to this happening in Arab countries.
Definitely, yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you so much. Definitely, there is this tug of war between different camps and different groups that really exemplify different positions, different ideologies, different perspectives. Not everybody is on board with the idea of feminism. Some people even think feminism is a dirty word. I don't think so. I see myself as a feminist. I have my own definition of feminism, which I do not see as contradicting my identity as a Muslim woman. I think it's very important to acknowledge multiple and other forms of feminism with a plural S, just like we should acknowledge different forms of struggle with a plural S and different forms of resistances and activism with a plural S. We should also acknowledge different forms of feminism with a plural S as well. So I personally don't think that there should be a clash or a contradiction or that they are mutually exclusive. But this perspective is not universally shared. Absolutely. There is a tug of war, and sometimes people say, I can be an activist, but please don't call me a feminist. Or, how can you be a Muslim woman wearing the hijab and at the same time you consider yourself a feminist? Aren't these terms somehow mutually exclusive? So I think that our job now, that's a very important mission that we can take upon ourselves, all of us, is to think about these terms, to reconsider, rethink some of these terms, some of these terminologies, some of these concepts, right? In a broader, much more nuanced, much more deeper, complex perspective, and say, okay, are these terms compatible or incompatible? It's like the debate around Islam and democracy. So people say, no, Islam or democracy cannot be compatible. You can either be a Muslim or you can be, an advocate for democracy. Why not? A lot of Muslim scholars said they can very much go hand in hand. So I think the main and major task, and that's not an easy task, is to try to rethink about all of these terms and concepts, right, in a much more nuanced and enhanced light, and think, where do they intersect? Where do they meet? Where do they diverge, right? And what can we learn from their intersections and divergences?
Thank you so much, Sahar. And I have a question from Nagam Naga about how the failed revolutions affected women's activism.
Yeah, that's a very big and very important question, because as I said in the presentation, the norm or the normal situation is that when you have a success, right, in a political movement, that should also give some opening for women's activism to go hand in hand. Although we should also be aware of the fact that because of patriarchal culture and sometimes stagnant traditions, it's not always the case automatically. And I'll just give the example of after the initial success of the 2011 revolution in Egypt and the ousting of President Mubarak, some women said, okay, it's our golden moment. Let's now go to Tahrir Square and we're going to have this women's march, right? And we're going to talk about women's rights. And only 500 women, came. I think they were hoping for 1 million women to show up. That didn't happen. I think, Marwa, you're laughing because you remember this, right? So only 500 women, showed up, and they were shouted at by people saying, go home, go to the hair salon, do your nails, whatever, but, don't bother us now. We have more important things to do. We are building a country. Well, how can you build a country if you neglect half of this country? How can you possibly put women's issues on the side or on the shelf and pretend it's not important and pretend that you are building the country without half of this country being considered and being at the table, right? So unfortunately, I think women still have a lot of work to do in order to find a place at the table and to save themselves, as I said, from being on the menu, being the victims or being sacrificed or being, marginalized or pushed aside. A lot of work needs to be exerted in this regard, and definitely the reversals in democratization in many of the so-called quote-unquote Arab Spring countries, with the exception of Tunisia, which I always like to highlight as a positive and shining example, has been very detrimental and had negative effects and implications on women's rights, representation, activism, and resistance in the region, in many cases curbing this kind of activism, right? If you know for sure that if you go out in the street and protest, you can die or you can be arrested, right? You are going to think 100 times before going out. More than that, even cyber feminism, even being online, right? Again, can become a very dangerous thing to do, because as we said before, the more visible you are, the more you become a target for regime hatred or even regime repression and retaliation. So it's a very risky landscape, And I hope that we see some light at the end of the tunnel sooner rather than later.
Thank you so much. Sahar. We have a question from Dr. Nusayri about what changes have you seen recently on the political level in terms of female representation and participation?
The countries which had, somehow either gained from the Arab Spring movement, as for example the case of Tunisia, always my favorite example, and I hope it stays this way with more success, I hope, right? And my co-editor in the book, remember, she is Tunisian, so that's an important thing to bear in mind. We have seen better laws being drafted in the case of Tunisia and better political participation, women getting a quota of representation in the parliament. We have seen women on the bench being judges, being lawyers, which is very important. As I said, somehow the legal sphere is forgotten. People talk about the political struggle, social struggle, cultural struggle, and somehow there's a blind spot, which is the legal sphere. But the legal sphere is very important because laws matter and laws impact many aspects of our lives. So that is a sphere that we have to pay attention to, and we have to try to acknowledge it similarly and equally, just like all the other spheres. So that has been a country that had some gains. There have been countries like Kuwait, for example, and Lebanon, where women historically have had better, quote-unquote, political representation and participation in the public sphere. In the other countries where women's rights have traditionally suffered, or countries that had reversals in terms of their journey for democratization and reform and change, as we have witnessed in the cases of Syria and Libya and Yemen and Egypt. Unfortunately, we can say that this is not at all the case. We can say that there's a shrinking margin of participation, even though there can be quote-unquote governmental tokenism, as in the case of trying to appoint more women to important high-profile positions. We're going to have more women ministers or more women in this particular council appointed by the regime in power. But remember what I said earlier about cosmetic feminism, right, and tokenism. If it does not trickle down sufficiently to a much broader grassroots level, it's not going to enact real change on the ground. That's a very important thing to remember, right? So some of my friends will say, yeah, but there are now women ministers in Egypt. There are, I think, 7 or 8 of them. Like, yeah, okay, awesome. And what is the situation in terms of women's economic prosperity at large, political participation at large, participation in the public sphere at large, voices in different domains at large? You cannot separate these issues from each other. If you have a stifling of political freedoms and a stifling of media freedoms in a society or in a country, definitely it's going to impact everyone, but it's going to impact women even more or even worse, because they're already disadvantaged, suffering from so many economic, social, and political limitations. So you're only adding to their already existing suffering and their already existing burdens.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Niveen, for the great questions. I just want to end of the discussion with the last question from a student, one of my students. So I'm kind of biased. So she's talking about the. So she is asking about. You mentioned something about the unpaid and informal female economic participation in the region, and she's also wondering about the effect of the pay discrimination and the gender wage gap on female marginalization, economic marginalization in the region?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, we talk oftentimes about the unpaid, right, informal, undocumented labor of Arab women, which not just Arab women, by the way, women in many parts of the world, right? If you look at Africa, if you look at Latin America, many parts of the world, women unfortunately put in hours and hours of labor. Let me just tell you, when I was doing my PhD at the University of Manchester, my field work was about Egyptian rural women. Right, and I was interviewing these women in their own homes and asking, do you mind telling me what kind of job do you do? And she would just shrug her shoulders, and with a tone of embarrassment, she would look down and say, oh, I'm not working. I'm just a housewife. So I even have a chapter in my own, thesis or my own dissertation, which is called I'm Just a Housewife, right? But in fact, if you ask her how many hours you're putting in, when do you wake up, when do you go to bed? She's working 12, 13 hours a day, right? Which is like, incredible. So, but this is not perceived as quote unquote work because it's not documented. But to the question here, of course, there is also cases where even women in the employment sphere or in the economic sphere or in the work sphere are not given the same, payment, or even in developed countries, in Western countries, here in the United States, let's face it, we are still talking about women being paid 70 cents to the dollar, right? In other words, the man gets $1, the woman gets only 70 cents or 80 cents. It's very unfair when they have the same degree, the same educational degree, they have the same qualifications, they have the same maybe experience. So it's a very unfair mechanism of discrimination. So if you think about the Tunisian law of violence against women. I would describe this as a form of economic violence, right? Remember, we have to revisit even terms like violence. It's not just about a man hitting his wife. If this is a form of economic violence and economic discrimination against women, and it does affect women in many parts of the world, including the Arab world. Surprisingly, it even affects women in more developed countries, including the United States. So I hope something is going to be done about it sooner rather than later.
Thank you so much for a very intriguing discussion and presentation. We really, really enjoyed it. And thank you for all your work and all of the, I know your work also has this activism dimension that I love about your work as well, Sahar. And I just want to say thank you, and if Naveen also wants to say something to conclude. But thank you everybody for coming, and my students for showing up. It's great to see you all here.
Let me reiterate thanks for the Middle East Studies program at University of Wisconsin-Madison for this excellent opportunity. And I'm more than happy to share my slides, my PowerPoint presentation afterwards with Professor Naveen and Professor Marwa to share with everyone else. And thanks so much for the invitation, and thanks so much for Dr. Naveen for the invitation, and Professor Marwa for moderating the discussion, Tyler for her help today with technology, and to everyone who attended and participated. Thank you so much.
Our pleasure.